All right, everyone, welcome to the presentation with Dr. Brad Cox. I'm going to turn it over to him. Just want to let you know that the Q&A is open, so if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to post, and we'll make sure that he gets those. Otherwise, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, I thank you, Ashley, and thank you all attendees for the opportunity to share with you today. This is clearly a topic that I feel pretty passionate about, and I'm glad to share that passion with you all, and as much as possible to share some of the insights and knowledge that I've gained over the years to be able to help you all understand and support autistic college students as they pursue post-secondary success. So I'm going to try just to give you as quick an overview as I can. Real quick, just a bit of a note about me. I'm here as an associate professor in the College of Education. I founded the, oh, you can't see this. I haven't shared screen yet. Look at that. I managed to pull that. It's like I've never done Zoom before. I hate when I show my age. Oh, that's why, actually, I can't. That's why it's disabled screen sharing.
Let me figure that out just a second.
Well, I'll put up the slide. That's the one that's oh, there we go. Okay, now you all can see that slide, right? Ooh, do y'all see this screen where I'm putting the big yellow
Yep, we're
shiny?
good.
Awesome. Okay. So just a quick note about me, so you can put this into a little bit of context. I'm an associate professor here at MSU. About 6 years ago, no, 8 years ago now, founded the College Autism Network, which is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to advancing access, experiences, and outcomes for autistic college students. That's my wife and kids. As a heads up, I got into this work primarily following the diagnosis of my son when he was 4 years old, so it is deeply personal to me. And then just a little bit of my educational background. So I've been at UNC Chapel Hill, South Carolina, and Penn State. So I also want to make sure I acknowledge up front several of the folks who have funded the work that I'm going to share with you today. So thank you to the Spencer Foundation, NSF, the College Autism Network, that nonprofit, and then Vanderbilt University's Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation. Many of the things I'm going to share with you today are based off of work that has been funded by them. And today I've got 5 things that I want to do with you all. The first is to talk about the language and numbers related to autism and neurodiversity. The second is to talk through connections between autism and STEM, because there are several, but there are also several stereotypes that may not be the kinds of things that are quite as true as we might make them out to be in our own mind. I want to talk very briefly, and I am an academic, and this is the stuff I study, so I'm going to have to put in a little bit of my own work about research on this topic. Then I want to close with a bit of information and some very specific examples, if I can, about how we can go about supporting students in college to be successful and successful in the ways that they define it. So I want to try to make sure that we close with action items. And as Ashley mentioned, please feel free to put questions in the chat throughout. And if I can, I will try to jump in and answer those questions right away. If not, or if I'm not in a spot to do so, I'll make sure we address those at the end. So please feel free to ask those questions. And then the last little bit is I'll introduce you to very briefly to the College Autism Network, where there are an awful lot of materials and opportunities for folks to learn more. So I want to start with this slide. And it's really a note about language. You will hear me use the term autistic student. You will hear me use the term ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, which is kind of how this issue was initially framed in the kind of psychological space. You also hear me talk about students with autism, so person first and identity first language. I do both because there is considerable disagreement depending on who you talk to, and I've had students that I work with use both identity first and student or person first language. So you hear me use both. But what exactly are the terms neurodiversity and autism. What do they really mean? And so I want to frame it in this way. So neurodiversity is a term that refers to the idea that brains, just like all sorts of other things that are human, they operate in a variety of ways. And it's just that some of them are more common than others. And a lot of times you'll hear the term neurodiversity used synonymously with autism, but sometimes that can include ADHD or dyslexia, dyspraxia, and various other forms of uh, neurological variation that are um, kind of yet undefined. I guess depending on who you ask, you get a slightly different definition of neurodiversity, but it generally is thought to include autism, which is where my work tends to come up. The term neurodiversity really was coined in the 1990s by a sociologist who was themselves on the autism spectrum. And Judy Singer, who came up with the term, really kind of put the idea that it isn't necessarily a disability to be autistic. And what does it mean to be autistic? Well, there are so many different definitions. I try to stay away from the clinical definitions when I can, but it's one of those neurological variations, and it manifests in a couple different ways. And in a neurotypical environment, which most colleges and universities, and maybe all colleges and universities really are, those differences and the neurology can manifest in some challenging ways that are not necessarily created by the student, not necessarily created by the institution, but by their intersection of being neurodivergent in a neurotypical space. And that can show up in terms of social communication, relationships, and in the classroom sometimes with abstract or indirect concepts. So why are we talking about this? In part, we're talking about this because we can't ignore it anymore. That some of the best estimates, and they're not good estimates, by the way, there's incredible variability in these, is that we may have as many as 167,000 undergraduate students right now with autism on college campuses. And I'll note that sometimes, a lot of times, these students are diagnosed before they get to college. But an awful lot of these students are in college with autism and either don't know it or don't have a formal diagnosis or won't get diagnosed until they are in college or even out of college. But what is striking to me is the pace at which this population has really grown. And you can see here in this dark blue population that this is the growth of autism coming into college over the last 10 years or so. And that number actually has continued to grow. But you can see relative to all sorts of other minoritized groups in higher education that in terms of rate of growth, autism is growing much faster than a lot of these other populations coming to college. Now, in terms of the raw numbers still, this 165,000 is far fewer than the number of women or part-time, et cetera. But in terms of rate of growth, they're coming to campuses in numbers that we've never seen in the previous 2 or 3 decades or before that. So that's all I've got about the numbers and the language. So I want to move into discussion of why we even think about autism and STEM in somewhat of the same kind of spaces or in the same mental space. And so I would argue that a lot of times our perception of autism and the links between autism and STEM fields is a function of what we see and know about autism from many other sources rather than from the research per se. And when we think about the places where we have learned about autism, and we pull that in from kind of popular press or the public media, or even kind of scientific lore. So for those of my generation or earlier, this is going to look familiar. I'd ask if anybody knows what that is, but it is Rain Man. And it was a movie from, oh gosh, the 80s, maybe the 90s. I was still young-ish at the time. And in this case, Dustin Hoffman's character is depicting, was the kind of the classic depiction of autism. And it was that of the what would be called the idiot savant back in the day. And the idea that the individual had some very unique, very specific talent, but that in other respects was underdeveloped. And that was kind of the mental model that a lot of folks had of autism back in the day. But over time, as we've learned more about autism, we've learned more about neurodiversity in a broader sense, we've started to see things like the good doctor show up on television who is explicitly autistic. And people have started to speculate about some figures in history that would, particularly scientific revolutionaries who saw the world differently and speculated a little bit about them being on the autism spectrum. But in the more recent years, we've seen that shift just a little bit because we've heard people all the time talk about Sheldon Cooper as being potentially or likely autistic. Um, oh my gosh, I just forgot his name, Max. This is Max from the show Parenthood. And we already saw Dr. Sean Murphy here. And this is Julia from Sesame Street. And this, by the way, is my son. And if you look at these things, do you notice anything? Because I do. I notice quite a few things, actually. But perhaps the most prominent is that these folks all look pretty white, and they all look, with one exception, pretty male. And that is actually reflective of a lot of disparities in diagnoses, in support. So that just as, back in the 80s, perhaps we thought of autism in this way. Well, even in the 2020s, it is often considered kind of a white male occurrence. And that is fundamentally inconsistent with the research. But we need to be hyperactive in recognizing that the mental models we have about autism or neurodiversity may prevent us from seeing clearly how autism affects other populations. And that's kind of perpetuating a disservice to those folks. By the way, another thing that you might also see in here is that we have medicine, we have science, we have engineering, and this is my son with the robotics. So there is a kind of public depiction of autistic individuals as focused on STEM fields, highly logical, brilliant, even if they're only in their own way. And so, if that's our public perception, then, well, is that really true? Well, in some respects, yes. In fact, there is a connection between autism and STEM. So when we look at the national studies, this is from a national study of, I think it was ninth graders or 12th graders from 2000. So it's a little bit dated, but it's the only national data we have on it. That students with STEM, approximately 35% of those students majored in STEM fields when they went to college. And this is higher than literally every other disability category. And this table, by the way, extends all the way out here with some other groups. And it is actually disproportional to the neurotypical population as well. A couple things I want to note. Whoops, I'll highlight this. This is from a project that I am leading. It's called the Pieces Project. You'll hear more about it later. But you'll also see here that 42% of the people who are participating in our study are themselves autistic. You'll note too that the numbers extend beyond 100%. That was in part because we allowed folks to indicate if they were taking a double major, things of that nature. But what I want to highlight is that while these numbers are really high, 34% and 42%, that means that still better than half, in fact, generally 2/3 of autistic college students are not actually taking their major in STEM fields. So we need to be particularly attentive to students across. Let me post. Would you be willing to post that? Oh, I'm sorry. There's a webinar chat. Are more interaction with? Oh, there was a question about individuals with ASD more comfortable interacting with machines than people. I think that's reflective of the stereotype that we were talking about in the last slide. Certainly, there are connections here, and I'll show you in a moment why some of the thinking that is common in autistic individuals or of the autistic brain does align a little bit with some of the ways in which we are engaging with machines or science or technology. I think that is perhaps a sentiment that could limit students' opportunities, particularly when it comes to making friends, interacting with peers, interacting with instructors, things of that nature. So if there is this clear connection, if there is this clear connection between STEM and autism, why is that? And part of the reason is likely to be about the commonalities in the way in which the disciplines in STEM tend to train their students, their scholars, the way in which people in that field are trained to think, and some of the natural ways in which autistic brains tend to operate. So there's this idea called hypothetico-deductive reasoning, and I love that term, though I have to struggle with it every time I say it. But essentially that in STEM fields, we are told regularly to use data, to use direct observable data, and we use deductive analyses to test specific hypotheses that are going to lead to logical conclusions. It's a very logical approach.
Could I just
And that,
pause for 1 second because we have a
yeah.
raised hand?
Oh, I can't see that. I'm
That's
sorry.
okay. Nope, Jessica, I do see your raised hand. I was just waiting to pause for 1 second.
Go ahead.
Jessica said that was a mistake. So sorry.
That's
Chris,
quite
do you
all
have a
right.
question? Chris, do you have a question? Does anybody have a question? Because now is a really good time to ask it because we're paused. Okay, well,
All right.
we're gonna move on. So hold your questions till the next time I see a raised hand. Thank you.
That's entertaining. That's quite all right. But that is consistent with how individuals with autism tend to, their brains tend to work. It is, there is a tendency for autistic individuals to be able to recognize or to develop or to apply very logical systems of reasoning, the way in which their brains tend to work. So there is some reason for the connection between autism and STEM. One slide that I wish I had put in here, but I just didn't get around to making it, is that one of the things that we think about STEM, and while this is true, that in fact this is a factor in how STEM fields operate, I want to highlight that it's not the only thing that matters in STEM. So if anyone is familiar with ABET, which is the accrediting body of engineering programs across the country, they put out 10, 12, 15 years ago, a report called, I think it was E2020, Engineer of 2020, and have subsequently followed up with a set of criteria about what a school needs to do and what it needs to demonstrate in order to be accredited as an engineering institution, degree granting engineering program. And while indeed the student outcomes include being able to test hypotheses and to do certain types of analyses, those criteria also include things like effectively communicating the results and the reasons why. It also includes an explicit reference to working as part of a team. And you can think about how these things might play out in the real world as well. So it's not just enough to be able to, calculate the load bearing of a particular beam in a bridge. That needs to be calculated correctly, absolutely. But it also is probably calculated because it is part of a larger structure, and that it has to be considered alongside materials cost and the rest of the design. And it is probably being built as part of a much larger team-based building project. And so even if we think of the way in which individuals with autism tend to think, and we know, like, oh yeah, there's clear alignment here, we also have to remember that it is just important for these students, as it is for every engineer, as it is for every college student, to build strong relationships and to build the strengths of communication and collaboration that will allow them to succeed once they get into that went too fast, once they get into the workplace. Quick questions thus far? Anything new from that last bit? While I pause and take a drink. Okay, so I'll move on. I'm going to take about 4 minutes of study here, and that's going to be really hard. I limited myself to just 1 or 2 slides per study, except for the most recent work. So this is my baby. This is the work I do every day. So if anybody ever has any questions on this, I promise you I have slide decks that are 5 times this long about each of these studies, but I want to try to give you the gist of what we found so that it kind of informs a little bit of some of the suggestions for how we can effectively work with these students. So study number 1 is from Wrong Planet. Wrong Planet is an online community that was created by an autistic individual, designed for autistic individuals, where they can be themselves, communicate with others. And there was within this online community an entire thread or strand or group that was about going to college and about being autistic while in college. So what we did with our study was to go in and do a content analysis of the things that people were posting in there and the questions they were asking, the advice they were giving to other autistic individuals. And our findings really fell into 2 specific realms. The first is support systems, in that the students who said they were successful said that they had multiple types of support systems that had to work in conjunction with each other. And those things included things like academic advisors and disability service offices. And that was like the institution provided services, the formal stuff. But they also had more informal or self-initiated networks of support. And that included, roommates, peers, parents, friends, professionals working outside of the institution itself. And what they noted was that while it is really helpful to have those things in particularly while you're transitioning into higher ed, it is really, really difficult, yet still important, to coordinate those various activities and those various support networks. Because if you're getting differing advice from the institution than you are from your parents, or differing advice from the Disability Service Center as you are from your faculty member, or the faculty member refuses or is uncomfortable implementing some of the things that were promised during orientation and then sort of provided by a disability service office, those conflicts create real tensions that can interfere with autistic student success. The second thing that they mentioned was a need for what we termed as safe spaces. And in some respects, this is consistent with what you may have seen or heard about safe spaces for other populations. But for autistic students in particular, they expressed how it can be a place where they don't have to wear their mask, where they don't have to hide being neurodivergent, where they don't have to hide the mannerisms of how autism manifests for them. They can take down that mask and truly be themselves. And if you can imagine just how stressful and draining it would be to constantly have to put on this mask and act normal when you can't act as yourself. And so a lot of times institutions could do things to support these types of safe spaces, and that could include things in the Disability Resource Center, where presumably people are more aware of and understanding of and appreciative and respectful of neurodivergence. But it can also be through training with a residence assistant in a residence hall, or working with a roommate as to how to interact or communicate effectively, roommate contracts, things like that. And then, of course, social environments. If you can think of a massive football game, think of an MSU football game and how that space may not be the most conducive to comfort among autistic students. There is a prescribed social norm that is expected, but it is also incredibly implicit. It is not explicit at all. It's not written down anywhere. You have to kind of figure it out on your own. It's a hidden curriculum sort of thing. And that providing either more explicit instruction or guidance or creating even a quiet space in a football stadium. Gosh, I don't know how you do that, but it could be of value to folks who need a little bit of a break from the high noise, high stimulus, and high social needs of a football game or basketball game or the like. Okay, that was study one. I think I did it in about 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to continue doing that quickly. Study number two is actually one set of interviews I did. There were 9 current and former students, including some who didn't get their diagnoses until after they were out of college, including some who really struggled in college and some who were really successful. And it led to a couple of papers here that I put up on the screen that I will talk through. One of the big things that people talk about is, oh, that's awesome. I didn't know, Nick, thank you. There apparently are a growing number of stadiums that have safe spaces for those with autism. That's fantastic. I didn't know that the Pistons and the Red Wings have one. I got to go check that out. I got to go check out a game anyway. So in this study, we found that students there was a real tension and connection and a pull in multiple directions with regard to identity and disclosure. So an awful lot of times we assume that a student can only get support if they tell you, hey, I'm autistic and I need support. Well, it turns out that that's not a terribly easy thing to do in a lot of spaces where that may not be welcomed. If you have to wear a mask in most social and interpersonal spaces on campus, the idea of openly saying, like, look, here, taking off my mask, I'm autistic, and this is what I want, need, how I work, etc. That could be a really difficult thing to do, and for good reason. And so for a student to be willing to do that, they had varying levels of comfort with different people and for different reasons. And their decision to disclose that identity as being autistic was often very much based on how well they were comfortable, how comfortable they were with their own identity as autistic, and in the specific need based on the circumstances. So, what I see here, what we found is that students were most comfortable and most frequently willing to disclose to disability services offices. They were much less likely to disclose to faculty members, and that was reported in part because of the response that they received. And were pretty cautious about disclosing information to their peers. And I'll give you just a couple of quotes from this to show you how this kind of manifests for students. And even though Edmund here talked about being comfortable in their own skin, they also talked about not sharing it unless it came up. There we go, is my laser pointer. Unless it came up from somebody else. And that was kind of reflected again by Daniel, who talked about one of those, welcome activities, get to know somebody activities in a class. And in this case, they were asked about various forms of identity. And so Daniel felt a little bit compelled to mention it, but apparently did so quickly and quietly, so much so that nobody else really noticed it. And so you can kind of hear in his voice the tension between, like, yeah, I want to disclose, but I'm not totally comfortable with disclosing because I don't know how people are going to respond. So I technically did disclose, but I don't think it was in a way that other people really caught on to. And so as we were looking through all of these data and looking at all these tensions, we realized that there were so many of these students who were putting that mask on and keeping it on. In fact, Adam, who was at the time of the interview going for his second doctorate, I believe, so a very successful student, was genuinely like beaming, was proud that he could fake people out, that he could get away with pretending not to be neurodivergent. And at the same time, he was self-aware enough to know that on the whole, that probably wasn't a good thing. To hide his identity, to be proud of being fake or of being able to fake it so much, that may not be the most healthy circumstance. And the mental health of these students is a concern that they express, and I'll share a little bit more about that as well. But what strikes me is that from this study, we built this kind of what we call the 3R model, which is a spot where there are these points of tension between a neurodivergent student and a neurotypical institution environment. And so oftentimes it is these autism-related characteristics, either the communication or the behavioral characteristics or the manners of thinking that contrast or conflict with institutional norms. When that happens, students start to recognize a problem. And by the way, in this study, the students were the one who brought up problems. I have always tried to frame things in terms of success. And in this particular study, quite literally 75% of the times that the word success was brought up, it was brought up by me as the interviewer. But almost 90% of the times that the word problem showed up, it was referenced by the students. So they saw their interactions with students or with institutions in part as a series of these problems or challenges that they had to navigate, and where I labeled them as tensions. So first, they recognize that there's a contrast between the institution and the student there. And then they have this point of tension. And part of the way in which they move forward there is that they reframe the problem. And the ability to do that is in part a function of how they view themselves, whether they see autism as a disability, how comfortable they are with disclosure, things of that nature. And if they are willing to disclose, the standard institutional response is through formal accommodations. And that's the kind of thing that RCPD does here and Disability Services Office across the country. Now, it turns out that sometimes those are very, very helpful, but for other times, it's not so helpful. And that's when oftentimes students had to develop personal connections with individual staff members, individual faculty members who would then seek to personally adapt the institution, its policies, its norms, its practices, its teaching to fit or to at least be more responsive to the unique needs and ways of thinking, ways of being for an autistic student themselves. All right. This study, I'm going to this is not, by the way, I apparently forgot to change the subtitle here. This is not about reflections from students. This is it. It's specifically a study of 1,213 students, essentially asking if there was any connection between the extent to which individual students, whether they had a formal diagnosis or not, whether there is a connection between the extent to which they exhibited autism-related characteristics and how well they did in terms of grades. And specifically, does being a STEM major help or hurt those grades? And does it help or hurt the effects of, or does it magnify or negate the effects of those autism-related characteristics? So I'll spare you all the method stuff, except for down here. But what it means in total is that I ran, what is that, 76 different tests in an effort to try to find some connection between autistic characteristics and grades, and whether those were mediated by their involvement in a STEM field. And of those 76 different tests, only 6 were statistically significant. And really, the results, frankly, were all over the place in terms of whether it was positive or negative, whether STEM mattered or not. And when you do a couple of little corrections for the fact that I ran, I don't know why 80, yeah. I don't know why, man, my numbers are just a little bit off by 1 or 2 here. But when you run those corrections, it turns out that there is a 98.7% chance that most of those findings are completely spurious. And so that, to me, after these corrections, when none of them would remain significant, that's a pretty clear indication to me that even though we might expect to find it, even though I went explicitly and extensively looking for it, I couldn't find any connection between autism related characteristics and their grades, which bodes well, provides a little bit of evidence-based confidence that these students can succeed both in and outside of STEM fields. All right, this last little bit is about the most recent study. So I promise I'm going to do this in like 5 minutes. Yell at me if I don't, because there's no way I will. This is the current project. This is supported by the Spencer Foundation, the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation, and the FAR Fund, the folks from the earliest slides. But essentially, this is a very large national, multi-institutional, multi-method, multidisciplinary study that longitudinally looks at how students define success. Whoop. There's the research questions, how they define success, what contributes to their success, and how those are interacting with marginalized identities, and particularly how those students with those multiple marginalized identities are experiencing college. I'll come back for a second just to acknowledge that this is by no means me. This is me and several other folks, including an autistic advisory board that's not pictured here. So it is truly a team effort. This is from our wave 1 results. We're in wave 2. We just finished wave 2 data collection. A couple things to note. First is that a full 2/3 of our sample identified somewhere on the queer spectrum, and a decent number of them identified as transgender or as gender fluid, or otherwise the non-binary as well, so that this was a really high proportion. And while I think this may be a little bit high relative to what we're finding in other studies, on the whole, autistic students are on the queer spectrum in much higher frequency than our neurotypical students. This study, as much as we tried, and I can tell you we tried incredibly hard to find ways to reach student populations that have been historically kind of overlooked in this research, it's still mostly white, although I will tell you that the 117 folks who identify as not, who don't identify as white, it's the largest number of those students of any study of autistic college students in the country. I also think it's worth noting, actually, I'll come over here first, that the vast majority of students report having some other disability, so a co-occurrence of ADHD or anxiety, depression, or some other disability. But what is also particularly noteworthy is that while half of the students did say that, yes, autism is a disability, a full 12% said, no, it's never a disability for me. And a solid 37% said that it is only sometimes a disability. And to me, that suggests that there are environmental factors, contextual factors that take what is normal for them in their behavior and is not at all a disability in some spaces. It becomes a disability in other spaces that are not respectful to or responsive to who they are and how they work. When we ask students to define for themselves what it means to be successful college students, some of these things are not going to be surprising, right? So getting out, graduating, right? Or developing expertise or employment, totally things that we see with everybody. But there was also a real heavy focus on mental health. These students would want to be successful academically, want to be successful in employment, but they expressed that they don't want to give up their mental health in order to be able to do so. And then the financial independence I highlight here, because while they talk about the importance of financial independence, we'll see on the next slide that they don't feel like they're actually achieving that financial independence very much.
We
And
actually
just
have a question
oh,
in the Q&A. Are you able
oh
to?
my God, I'm missing it. Yep, thank you.
This came up.
What do we got? Okay. Oh my, that's a long question. Okay, where do women fall in the data for STEM majors? I've been reading identifies women being tuned into people as a special interest, and therefore wondering if more women in social sciences do I have to fail division? Notice that many of the interviewees were male. Yep. Sought out females for interview. If that's shareable and how their answer is different. Okay. Okay. So the question was basically about gender differences in pursuit of STEM fields and in some of the kind of college experiences as well. So for the studies up until now, I do not have that data. So the Wrong Planet study, we didn't have any gender data. The interviews, all but one, no, I'm sorry, all but two identified as male. And in this most recent study, though, we were very, very effortful in trying to draw students who are minoritized in multiple ways, including gender identity. So we have got a much larger sample of women and non-binary gender fluid folks than in any other study of this kind. Frankly, we just haven't gotten around to actually analyzing the data in a way that would kind of split it out that way. I'm trying to see if I can speculate in any real way here. I would presume that there would be some gender related differences in terms of the likelihood to go to STEM fields, but I can't say that that's a prominent feature of the research thus far. I think a lot of that has to do with who does participate in these studies. Um, we will be interviewing, we've interviewed 43 students, and we were explicit in trying to front load the women students of racially minoritized backgrounds, students who were attending community colleges, et cetera. So yeah, I guess I'll refrain from speculating too much other than to say that there probably are differences. I just don't have the evidence to suggest what those differences might be or how big those differences are. And thank you for the question, and I'm happy to answer others as they come up along the way. In terms of the least important things, it's funny that the job other respects wasn't terribly important to them, but getting something that is of interest to them was considerably important in terms of their jobs. And then some of the things that this one strikes me as well, because a lot of times when we're working with students and we're, what do I do? How do I be successful in college? Like, oh, get involved, do things, join this club, or, show up at this activity. And that's just not important to these students, at least not to the extent that many of these other things are. That is, in fact, I think the lowest scoring item in terms of what they thought would be what it would mean to be successful in college. But when we look at what they are actually successful at, what they say they are successful at, they are very much doing a good job academically, staying enrolled, getting good grades, et cetera, and exploring identities beyond autism, so gender, race, et cetera, and to some degree becoming better self-advocates. But what I want to highlight here is mental health and financial independence, because if you note, in the stuff about what is important to them, what does define success for them, mental health and financial independence were very important to them. But they tell us that those are two of the three things that they struggle with the most. So those are areas where we can be really targeting some of our support when we are trying to support these students' success. Overall, from the study thus far, just a quick reminder that success is more than academics. It includes, but it is much more than academics, that there are tensions both within the individual student and external to the student, and the connection between the two, between the environment and the individual student, and that psychological well-being is critical to what these students want and where they are finding challenges that we can be supportive of. So I mentioned that I was specifically wanted to get at how we can be supporting these students. So I want to suggest that there are considerations about who can do the support, where that support can come from, and how that support can be delivered. So first off, I just want to highlight some of the things from our previous study that show that there is incredible variability. So a lot of times this comes down to the individual student. And so yes, we can take some systemic kind of approaches, and there are things that we can do at the institution level. But that if we want to influence individual student success, we need to work with that individual student to see what they define as success and what they would find beneficial on their way to collegiate success. So a couple of other things that I want to highlight, that the most helpful things that students reported to their success, that included some things that were truly their own, right? Academic skills and grit, though we can certainly support both of those. The biggest thing was their major coursework. When they were taking the courses they want, they felt that was a huge contribution to their success. But one of the things that a lot of people assume is that students with autism are self-isolating, that they don't want to be in community, that they're not good at connecting with other people. And what they told us is that when they can, and when they do find friends, peers, that they find those folks to be incredibly supportive and incredibly helpful. And I want to contrast that a little bit with family, because much to our surprise, family was not even in the top half of things that were reported by these students as being helpful to their college success. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment here. But I guess I do want to highlight that faculty matter, so their instructors matter, and academic accommodations, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, where most people kind of start when they think about supporting these students. Those matter. But I will note that for these four things, including the accommodations and the disability services, and including instructors, as students go through their college career, as they move from freshman, sophomore to junior and senior year, the benefit, the helpfulness of these services or these individuals actually declines over time. So just a quick note about what those things were that were particularly helpful or not helpful. The grit and the self-awareness are very much individual things that can be um, built up or developed, and oftentimes happens before they get to college. There are some things that we can do as colleges, particularly as it relates to employment, that we clearly need to rethink a little bit about how we're doing some support for students pursuing employment. They also offered a couple of suggestions about what they would like. They want the direct support. They want those spaces. The accommodations, they would like them earlier, easier to access, and perhaps more varied. But this part is, I think, really important as well. Clearer structures in navigating the college process. There is a lot of hidden curriculum, and these students are particularly literal, linear, etc., that we want to be able to lay out for them. Here is the task list. Here is the pathway through. If you can do these things, this is a pathway to success, rather than trying to throw the whole map of the whole forest at them and say, make your own way. So a couple of things that came up from the students themselves. They do like accommodations, but they want accommodations that are specific to autism. So yes, sometimes the standard kind of things like an extended time on a test is, those standard disability service accommodations that is provided for all kinds of students with disabilities. And sometimes that helped. But the students also reported the desire for having roommates, for being able to have a single room and have that be an accommodation rather than an additional cost that they have to pay, or being able to take their tests in a separate room that has an environment that is more set up for their own sensory sensitivities, that kind of things.
Could I take a brief pause? Because we have a question
Yep.
in the Q&A.
Gotcha. Most least hopefully identify or what I would list for. Yeah. So the things that are in terms of pretty helpful, yes, indeed, a lot of things that you see here. In fact, a lot of things for what the definitions of success are. There is an awful lot of overlap between what we would think of as success and the things that contribute to success. There is an awful lot of similarity between autistic students and neurotypical students. No, we did not put a particular a particular control group against which to compare, in part because that reinforces the kind of normalized approach, that the normal students think this way. So by removing them as a control group, that we are able to focus specifically on what does matter for these students. And if it's the same for everybody, that helps them even more. And frankly, it makes it easier to implement some of these things because the benefits are universal. They're not these things are not things that are exclusive to autistic students. The things that we would do over here is in terms of the structures and the support we can provide, these are things that will directly benefit students well beyond those on the autism spectrum. Some of the ways we can do that would include both at the systemic level or the structural level and at the individual level. So I want to walk you through a couple of these things pretty quickly. Professional development basically is they all said, like, we wish more people understood autism. We wish our faculty members knew what we were talking about when we said we had this experience or this need. And we wish we could go into the Career Services Office and the Disability Service Center and the Student Union and feel the same level of welcomeness and understanding. But there were also some folks who were part of specific autism support programs. But then I want to highlight at the end here the ways in which we as individuals can directly support these students. I mentioned very briefly autism-specific support programs. Yes, they exist. And yes, there are, I think the number now is that there are 95 of them, maybe over 100 by now. But one of the things to note is that they are heavily concentrated, so that if you were to live here, you literally would have to go out of state and go hundreds of miles away to be able to find an autism support program. And on the whole, they are pretty expensive. And that there are plenty of programs, 21 programs out of, I think there was the 64 that we were looking at in this particular study, cost, in addition to tuition and fees and room and board and things like that, they cost $5,000 or more. Sometimes that gets picked up by insurance or by vocational rehab, but more often than not, it's on the families to be able to provide that $5,000 extra. So again, another way in which systemically, even where you're trying to provide direct support for these students, we're disrupting their ability to get support in other places because it costs so much. I mentioned the Disability Services Office and the RCPD here, and students absolutely appreciated the accommodations. Those accommodations were repeatedly referenced as being helpful to their success. So I want to make sure that we give props to those folks who are implementing those accommodations. And you can see the quote here from a student who, directly credited them, but they also suggested that there were plenty of other things that they could get from the institution that would be equally helpful. And again, that solo housing or private spaces would be helpful for them. But what I really want to highlight here is that we cannot assume that it is just a disability service office issue, and that we can't just pass these students off and say, oh, they're getting their help here. And only in the Disability Service Center. So that while indeed half the students or more, particularly first year and second year, said that it was in fact very helpful for them to go to their disability service office, that number dropped by nearly 20% among our juniors and seniors. And what is really scary to me is that nearly 25% of the students who were listed as juniors and seniors said that the disability service offices were actually more harmful than helpful. And that could look in all sorts of different ways. I'm happy to unpack that even more at some point if folks want to look at it. But I think that suggests that we can't simply rely on the Disability Services Office to provide those the support that students need.
I also
I see
want
a
to pause
oh,
because
go
it's an
ahead.
interesting question in the Q&A about online courses versus
Yep.
in-person courses.
I was just going to go there. Yeah. So the question was about whether there are studies about how these students do in online versus in-person courses. So we are not personally looking at that. There is some assumption that these students would do well in online courses because some of the social pressure is reduced. Some of the structures are more regimented or preset. So there's some reason to think that they might be more successful in those spaces. At the same time, it creates its own, it has its own yet to be, like firmed up and still kind of fluid set of expectations about what engagement looks like. There are multiple sources of sensory input that are coming in at the same time. And imagine if you have your Zoom screen up where there are 40 other people in your class who are all looking back at you, and then you have to be able to navigate that space. And when you have faculty members, and for that matter, students who are not settled in how to interact and how to behave in an online environment, it has a set of social expectations that, as much as the in-person class has its own unique form of behavioral norms or behavioral expectations, the online space, it has its own behavioral norms and expectations, but they're not clear yet. And it's not even easy to tell anybody or to recognize what those norms are, which creates its own unique kind of challenge for autistic students as well. But that actually leads nicely into my next slide here, which is the idea of universal design for learning. And this is essentially the idea that we want to give students an opportunity to have multiple forms and multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression. And you mentioned the online course. This is one of the things that is a form of engagement, that there can be in any class things that students do in person in the class session, but also that they do online, so that the student can engage in the learning experience in multiple ways, that we provide information in multiple ways. So yes, the traditional slides and lectures, those work, and they can be useful. But to truly be universally designed, we want to be able to provide multiple forms of that information. And that could include by doing external readings. It could be involving providing YouTube videos. It could be having the students do their own research so that they can find the information in a way that works best for them. And then finally, the multiple means of action or expression. To me, this always means assessment. So that in my classes, for example, I never have a single form of assignment be the dominant form. So some of them are written, some of them are presenting, some of them are digital, some of them are in person. They can be creative through videos and graphics. And yeah, sometimes there's still those kind of standard tests, but that is that variety ensures that we reach folks who have these different, not just learning styles, but ways in which their brain works. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of this stuff is good for autistic students, but it's good for everybody. Universal design for learning is supportive of all students learning, and that we can provide those opportunities, those multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression for everybody. All right. I swear I'm almost done. Actually, do I have another 5 minutes? Do people have 3 extra minutes, or do I need to sprint through these and be that guy?
It's 10:57 and we go till 11, so people can stay after if they wish.
Okay, well then I will sprint through these, and I
Okay.
apologize. But just a quick note that what two things that we can do an awful lot are to facilitate choices and to provide a type of communication that would support these students. The choices in terms of the pathways that students take towards a degree and what classes they have to take. We already talked about some of the things that would happen in class. Physical spaces as well. So whether they have their own space to take a test, or whether you would say when a student comes by, do you want to meet in my office here? Are the lights okay? Do you want to close the door, or do you want to meet at a coffee shop, or do you want to meet at the conference room, at the table, whatever? Again, giving them some decision making so that they can set up the environment that works for them. And then this communication thing is one that a lot of people talk about, and I just want to give some very specific guidance here. So first off is to be direct. If you are talking about a paper, or the student asks you about a paper, talk about that paper. Talk about that paper first and directly, instead of talking about all the other assignments that led up to that paper. They're asking about the paper. That's what they want to know about. And then as much as you can be direct in your suggestions or guidance, provide task lists doing this, this, or this in this order. That allows them to develop a checklist so they know exactly what they need to be doing. And again, that's coming back to the kind of literal way in which they process information. To be explicit. And this means to be direct and explicit when you are providing feedback, and that includes in an advising space or in an academic space. This was good, this was bad, this is where you made this mistake, this is where you got this right. And part of that means that we need to reduce just a little bit our tendency to try to couch things and then assume that students will read between the lines. These students are going to read the words that you write or say, and they're going to take those words as exactly what they mean, exactly what you mean. And the way to do that clearly is to be pretty comprehensive in your feedback or your communication, and also to be consciously trying to constrain that ambiguity or the extent to which we need students to read between the lines. Last slide, I promise. The last bit is that I mentioned earlier that it's more than just a disability services office. It's more than just the instructors. The counselors who are working with students in mental health have a big role to play here. But also, so do the everyday staff or administrators. So do the advisors who help them select their courses or hold meetings with them. Certainly at the policy level, there's a lot more we can do. And frankly, so do other students. They play a role in this. But I also want to highlight that these supports can happen anywhere. It certainly can happen in the classroom, but it can happen in the residence halls too, that can be conducive to student success. They can happen, as I mentioned, in the offices, and how bright the lights are, whether the door is open or closed, those kind of things. But even in some more non-traditional places, so dining halls or even on the buses. And then we mentioned earlier online. So offering to let people turn on or turn off their camera as they feel comfortable, or to use the text chat rather than voice chat if that's what they would prefer. And finally, I want to highlight the nonprofit, the College Autism Network, where you can find all sorts of resources, including case studies, some fast facts. We have a conference every year that draws 300 plus people. We have a variety of online training services as well. And I'm happy, of course, to talk about any of those things. So with that, I will say thank you. And if you have any questions, please don't ever hesitate to reach out. And if you have any questions now, I'll be happy to stick around if folks would like to. But thank you for the opportunity to share with you.
All right. Thank you so much to Dr. Brad Cox for joining us today. I know that we are at time, but if you have questions, you are welcome to stick around for a few minutes. Otherwise, we will make sure that his contact information gets distributed to you. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.